For today's game of the day, we have a vintage Hikaru Nakamura performance. He demolished Ian Nepomniachtchi's Sicilian in the 6th round of the Moscow Grand Prix. The game started pretty naturally. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. So we've got the knight off thus far. After a6, Nakamura opted for bishop to g5. Now e6, f4, this has all been played thousands and thousands of times. Here we see queen b6. Now Hikaru said that he made the move a3 to just get a simple game. He wanted to play chess and avoid a lot of theory. Instead, the very complex line ensues after queen to d2, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3. This is what's known as the poison pawn variation. It is very tricky, very complex, many tactics, and just simply craziness ensues. So in the game, as noted, Hikaru went a3 here. The point being that now queen takes b2 is impossible because simply knight a4, well, that picks off the queen. The queen has no escape route, and thus white goes up a lot of material. So of course queen takes b2 was not played. Knight c6, challenging the knight in the center. White does not want to capture knight takes c6, because if you capture knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, black has captured towards the center. The b2 pawn now is under threat, and this queen actually has access into the e3 square, and the dark squares are weakened for white. So accordingly, knight takes e6 was not played, knight b3, a much better move. Bishop e7, queen d2, covering the dark squares. Castles, castles, queenside. So this is a first important note. Both players have castled on opposite sides. This means that black would love to storm the pawns on the queen side and launch an attack, but it's very difficult. The queen on b6 here blunts this pawn on b7. I really shouldn't say blunts, but it does blockade it, and to waste another move with the queen move is not really getting anything in motion. So white, on the other hand, can very quickly start moving the h-pawn and then eventually try to get this g-pawn up the board as well. In the game, rook d8 was played, bishop d3, and now h6, a very natural move. If bishop to h4, well, we see that this bishop on e7 is spying to the h4 square. That opens up an idea like knight takes e4. And after a capture back on e4, well, now we can get away with capturing the bishop. Black goes up a pawn. This is not good for white. So instead of bishop to h4, you might be expecting bishop takes f6. Well, if I can't retreat, I might as well capture it. But not so fast. The move pawn to h4 is a very good option here. The point being that if the mistake h takes g5 is played, after h takes g5, we see this rook having an open file, and that will help deliver checkmate. For instance, if knight g4, well, here comes rook to h4, and there are just no pieces helping the black king. This rook will eventually slide over to h1, and a move like knight to f2 doesn't actually really help, because after rook f1, yeah, even if you capture this bishop on d3 and you temporarily go up a piece, this rook eventually sliding over to the h-file with devastating effect. So h takes g5, not played by black. The move that was played was bishop d7. Now I'm going to just stop for a second here. Can you find a better move than bishop b7? Because Nepomniachtchi, he was very critical of his own play. He thought that he should have played knight to g4 here. The point is that now the knight can't get kicked because his pawn on h4 can't go backwards, and there's now threats of knight f2, perhaps queen to e3 with a trade if things get bad, but white is now forced to capture on e7, and after bishop e7, knight takes e7, rook de1, the position is still very unclear and actually can become quite double-edged, but black is much happier here than the game continuation. In the game, bishop d7 was played, and after bishop to d7, queen to e2. So now knight g4 is not an option. Of course, h takes g5 is completely out of the question because the knight doesn't have escape route to g4. And if we see this kind of structure happen, the queen is actually going to come to h5 and deliver a checkmate. So king to f8 was played, hoping to get out of this h-file, all these problems in the h-file. And here Nepo was hoping for a slower move like king to b1, which is actually still fine, but not as direct as the game continuation, which saw the move pawn to e5. Nepo thought that this move might help him in some variations, perhaps that pawn on e5 can become a target, but Nakamura was not to be deterred. He knew that his attack was about to rage on. d5, fe5, now h takes g5 because, well, what else? You can go knight d5, but black's position is looking very risky. I can, of course, capture on d5 immediately, then trade the bishops. This king on f8 is just not in a good spot, and white will launch a humongous attack. So he went h takes g5, e takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now h takes g5. Here again, Nepo was a bit self-critical. He thought that perhaps he could have gotten away with bishop takes c3, and after b takes c3, king e7, well, this just looks really bad. Rook h7 is coming, rook g8, and I think a move like bishop to c4 is good enough, threatening to go g5 to g6, after which this pawn on e6 will become quite a target. So bishop takes c3, I mean, I don't think this kind of idea will really help black much, and I think that not going knight g4 earlier might already make this position too late to really be salvaged, but perhaps there's a fighting chance there, just wrecking the white queen side where the king is. Bishop takes g5 check, king to b1, and now queen to e3. Well, Nakamura just continues the attack. Of course, you're not going to trade queens. And actually, one point worth noting is bishop h6 looks like it might close the h-file, but nope. Rook takes h6, g takes h6, and now the rook slides over, not to h1, but to f1, and with the queen coming to h5, there's all sorts of mating ideas. Black is just completely lost. Really hopeless position. Now, this is something that you should definitely look at on your own to see if you could finish off the attack. But back to the game. Queen e3. Okay, white is not in favor of trading queens. Queen h5, bishop h6, rook hf1, bishop e8, rook de1, and now queen g5 was played. Practically speaking, rook takes d3 might make white's task much more difficult. Now, we can trade. Sorry, I shouldn't say trade. I should take your queen on e3, and after rook takes e3, we pause for a material count. Black has a minor piece, a rook, and a pawn for a queen. Lasker compensation. Is it enough? Well, I wouldn't be so sure. The black king is still quite vulnerable, but at the same time, the bishops really come to his defense. So practically speaking, this might have been the superior option. Instead, after rook d to e1, queen g5 is played, queen h3, not trading queens, of course. And now knight to e5. Well, the knight's got to do something, get into the game. I mean, the queen is quite vulnerable on g5 as well, as we see will happen. But other moves didn't exactly help either. Rook ac8, well, you're trying to get your rook into the game, but doesn't do anything. Knight e4, queen d5, and now a beautiful shot, knight f6 is available. So black is really struggling in this position. Even after rook takes d3, well, I simply take with the pawn. After king to g8, well, your king's trying to escape, but my knight comes to e4. And after queen g6, ideas like rook f3 come into play. So honestly speaking, black is just really out of good options. And a move like king g8 doesn't help matters at all because knight to e4 is quite simple as well. So queen h3, knight e5, knight c5, a nice move. Now e6 is under attack. And after king g8, it looks like you've escaped the pin, but I'm still capturing on e6, so the tactics work in my favor. Now after f takes e6, which is pretty much forced, queen e6 check, here knight f7 was played. Well, bishop f7 might give black much better chances. Queen takes e5, queen e5, rook e5, and we enter a position where, yes, black is down a pawn, but he also has the two bishops, which can provide sufficient compensation in some variations. White is still much better, but black is still alive and kicking. Instead, after queen takes e6, Nepo went knight f7, but after bishop g6, that knight is just going to be picked off. King h8, bishop takes f7, bishop f7, queen f7. So let's take stock. White is up one pawn. Black has a bishop versus a knight, but the bishop on h6 is really just a very defensive piece. This knight eventually can come into play. The pawn on b7, as we'll see in just a couple moves, also comes under direct threat. So queen takes g2, defends b7, takes a pawn. But rook g1, the attack rages on. Queen d2, rook d1, queen f4, and queen takes b7. So, okay, white is now gobbled up a pawn, so 3-on-2, but it's really 3-on-1 on the queen side that's important. That pawn on g7, even if somehow the queens get traded, it's not going anywhere. And after rook to b8, queen e4, Now Black did have the chance to trade off the queens and enter an endgame, but this endgame is pretty hopeless. After queen e4, knight e4, bishop f4, hoping to reroute to e5 and attack with pawn on b2, White can consider two options here. One is rook to d5, taking away the e5 square and also threatening to come over to the h-file, and also rook d7 should also be plenty good. Because bishop e5 doesn't really do much, I can always just move my pawn to b3, for example. So it's a one-move threat that doesn't actually help too much. So queen f8 was played, and here it's really just all over. Rook g6, rook a7, and now the finishing touch was queen to d4, because as you might see, this rook on a7 is under direct threat, and now rook takes h6 is deadly because the pawn on g7 is pinned. So he was forced to resign, and he regretted his move rook a7, but even after a move like rook e8, I mean, it just kind of delays the inevitable. So what to make of this game? Sure, Nakamura won in very convincing fashion, but it all goes back. Let's take a moment to just scroll all the way back to move 13. It's crazy that move 13 was the culprit in a 30-plus move game, but when you see this position after h6, h4, you really have to be cautious. Sure, your king might not be checkmated immediately when you go bishop d7 and king f8, but your king's not really escaping anytime soon anyway. Instead, this is the vital moment, knight to g4 allowed Black to continue, get some activity, and fight in a complex battle. So for the game of the day, round 6 of the Moscow Grand Prix was Hikaru Nakamura beating Ian Nepomniachtchi.